Hi everyone. You're listening into What's Going On, a podcast where we have important, relevant, and sometimes difficult conversations to inspire you to start your own. In today's episode, we're talking about anti-Asian racism and the model minority myth. As we explore the history and the role Asians play in American society with our guest speakers today, I'd like for us to acknowledge that the progress we have made is built on the destruction and eradication on Indigenous folks and their culture. What's Going On is by Suffolk University's Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion in Boston, Massachusetts. Hence, we would like to honor the Mashpee Wampanoag, Akina Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts tribal nations whom this land originally belonged. It is imperative to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe, who historically lived in areas that make up present-day Greater Boston. We honor the diverse tribes, people, and respect their connection to this land. As we discuss today's topics, let us remember to advocate alongside the local Indigenous community for their rights. To know more about the land you are on and ways you can support the Indigenous community, please visit www.native-land.ca, and for those of us in Massachusetts, maindigenous.org. Further resources from this episode will be in the description box below. And with that, I welcome my guests for today, Mike and Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Lowe. I also go to Suffolk University, class of 2023. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And yeah, I've joined I am not a virus just the past few months in September of 2020. At Suffolk, I'm part of the volleyball team. I'm a part of the newly created Women in Business Club. And yeah.
Hi, thanks for having us on. My name is Mike Keo. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am a father, a husband, a photographer, and the founder of the I'm Not Virus campaign that began in Connecticut.
Before we move on, just a trigger warning for those of us who are listening in. The topic that we're going to talk about today may include Asian American history, and that may involve your close family members, and so can stir up some emotions within you. So please exercise self-care and join us whenever you feel better and feel that when you're able to. So with that, let's move on. Mike and Michelle, you mentioned, hashtag I'm not a virus. Would you want to talk to us more about that and what the initiative is about?
So back in February, we were hearing this rhetoric, right, of the Chinese flu, the Wuhan flu, the Chinese virus, and it struck the chord with me. You know, I understood that attacks against Asian Americans happen every few years. There's always this is not the first time. You know, we could go to in the Boston area. There was Bang Mai who was killed in the early 2000s, right? Vietnamese American teenager killed in Dorchester for being Vietnamese American. I remember in 2009, you had the Hmong folks up in the Midwest that were targeted and killed after a case of a Hmong hunter. And there were these signs that said, save a deer, kill a Hmong. You know, this can go back to Vincent Chin. It could go back to the lynchings of in the 1930s in I believe Watsonville. You know, so this isn't really new. It's always existed. And for me, what that meant was that I was seeing people that looked like my mom, my father, my wife, um, you know, my grandparents, like they were being attacked inside a supermarket. You know, it might happen in California, but it still resonated with me in Connecticut. And in Connecticut, there were attacks in March, and already in March, you know, within like 5 minutes from my house. And for me, in February, what occurred to me was that I needed to do something creatively just to get rid of this tension I was feeling. I was feeling helpless. I was feeling angry, and I tend to create when I'm in those moods, and so I brought in my siblings. I brought in my friends, and I photographed them inside my studio without a mask on, smiling after these interviews about racism against Asian Americans, right? And we created a space where we allowed them to say, "Who are you? If you're not a virus, if you're not stereotype, then what are you?" And oftentimes, people of color, especially Asian Americans, aren't given that opportunity. I think we're asked, "Where are you really from?" But who are you? And so people would say, "I'm a rock climber. I'm someone who loves comics. I am a lover of household plants." These are some of the things that we received, or like, I am a master at making pot stickers. And I thought that was just powerful in itself. And when Governor Lamont closed down what was closed down the businesses and everything, I took the photos online, and it resonated with people from around the world. Where they felt that with this "I am" statement, they can jump in, and it sends a message that this is not an attack against a virus, but an attack against one's neighbor. And who's committed to um, protecting your neighborhood. It should be on all of us.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've been here for 2 to 3 years now. And for those who don't know, I'm an international student and I identify as a Singaporean Chinese. And coming here, I think a lot of people don't expect us to be targets of discriminatory and oppressive attacks. So what you're doing is really important, and you're right. We need for people to see us beyond the stereotypes of being docile, of being nerdy, and we'll talk more about that. Playing into the model minority myth. And I'm just curious with you, Mike and Michelle, what have you is there anything surprising you have learned from this journey of setting up hashtag I'm not a virus?
So I recently joined in September, and I think what's surprising to me, I know I like kind of just started like with I am not a virus, but what's really surprising to me is like where I grew up. I guess in a way I was kind of in a bubble, but a good bubble. I was surrounded by so many different people from so many different backgrounds. I went to quinceañeras, I went to 9-man tournaments, I went to Hmong tournaments, I went to cookouts, I went to everything, everywhere. So in a way, I guess I got lucky enough to be in a bubble with so many different type of people. And I guess it was surprising to me that I always wonder like if me and all my friends got along so well, had so many good times growing up together without, like worrying about where we came from or the color of our skin. It's just surprising to me seeing, like the rest of the country or the rest of the world, like it's a struggle to accept one another. It's weird because I the way I grew up, I guess in a way I was sheltered from the real world, but it was just surprising to me. And I know now, like, I'm growing up and I see what's going on now and it's crazy, but yeah, there's a lot of people now who are working on change, and I think that's a very important step in we're all moving in the right direction.
I don't know what was surprising for me. Like, I'm trying to think of it. I think what was surprising was this idea of community, right? So many of these communities popped up random, like not randomly, but so many communities popped up during COVID-19 um that work for social justice, and I think that was really inspiring to see. I know locally we've had folks from nationally that we work with, and locally in my hometown of West Hartford, there's been there was a group called Concerned Parents of Color of West Hartford, with Adrian Billing Smith, who's a close friend now, and she and then there's been like the equity teams at like the local elementary schools, and so my hometown feels a lot closer for me. So that was something that was really surprising for me, because I live in a pretty liberal space where you're liberal up to a certain comfort. You know what I mean? Where like if you're asking for a little bit more, they might be like, "Oh my god, I thought we were doing enough." But what was really, really surprising for me was to find this group of folks that were in my town that were creating change. Like, I had to shout out Ace. She's gotten the green that was named after a slave owner, renamed to Unity Green. She had Juneteenth recognized in town, and the work she's doing is amazing. They're doing this podcast, not the podcast. They're doing a talk later this month for students, especially BIPOC students, on financial aid and applying to colleges. So for me, that was super inspiring to see something so local and cemented in our hometown.
Yeah, grassroots is where it's at. If there's one thing I learned from just the past year, is really the power of local organizing and community. And it's really great to hear that there are people within your community doing that. As a first generation student, it can be really deterring to not just have to think about what college is like and figuring out the paperwork for college. It's also nice to have a sense of community of people who not just look like you, but because they share their identity, they know what you've been through or what you will go through and be able to give you the advice that's more applicable and useful in that way. And so that's great to hear. And talking about slavery, talking about Asian American history, a lot of people are aware of the Chinese Exclusion Act and also the internment camp that happened in the West Coast. I think not a lot of people don't know about the fact that there were 15,000 Chinese migrants who built the Transcontinental Railroad, and that's actually one of the ways that in that way the Chinese set up their roots in the States. Do either of you are aware of that piece of history? And would you wanna, if you do, talk about that?
Yeah. What another thing that's it's not surprising, but I feel like us as Asian Americans, we need to embrace our stories and be able to share these personal anecdotes, right? That are upcoming, how we grew up. I think William Tong, the Attorney General of Connecticut, had this piece where he says that so many people think that coming within our community that everyone comes with 2 cents in their pockets. Everyone comes from as immigrants or refugees, and so we don't think that these stories are worth telling. And I think for I'm Not a Virus, what we've seen is that these stories are not just worth telling, but they can grow larger movements and bring folks in together. So we've created a coloring book here called History is Colorful with our friends Admiration and the Immigrant History Initiative. And the cool thing about this coloring book is that Asian Americans are represented, not just East Asians. So you have Chinese Americans, you have also South Asians, Southeast Asian Americans, as well as queer LGBTQIA plus representation of Asian America. So it really fleshes out what our community is, because we are a diaspora. We share one continent. Our ancestors shared a continent, but there's no common language. There's no common religion. And speaking about the Chinese Americans, I think when we talk about Asian American history, this is American history. You know, this should not be considered a subset of just for Asian Americans. I think everyone needs to learn this history, right? And I remember being 15, and the reason why equity work is so important to me is at 15, I was in a class called American Studies, and we were reading this book called Ragtime. And I don't remember much from Ragtime. I do remember there was a scene of Chinatown, and folks were referred to as cat-like Chinamen, so I was called cat-like Chinaman. But I had a friend who talked about Chinatown, about how she didn't want to go because it smelled bad, because it was dirty. And my teacher goes, well, you don't have to eat the rats or the pigeons there. And the entire class erupts in laughter, 40 students and 2 educators staring at me, the only Asian American student in class. And I can't begin to tell you how lonely I felt at that moment. And growing up and accessing these stories, I realized that the reason why I was so lonely in that particular moment was because their version of Chinatown was not authentic to me. Chinatown for me was a place that I would go with my parents and my grandma and my siblings. We'd sit at a seafood restaurant, pick a fish, a lobster, so you get the steamed ginger with the flounder, and you would get the lobster Hong Kong style, and you would have this great meal that you couldn't really get in Connecticut. And afterwards, my parents would give me $20 to go buy any DVD or Gundam set, and they would buy fruits, right? So we would get mangosteen, we get lychee, Logan, durian, and we pack them back to Connecticut so we can enjoy them for the week. And that particular moment where she said that we don't have to eat rats or pigeons in Chinatown, she stripped that all away from me. That cultural identity, that pride from me. And so for me, Asian American history not only allows Asian Americans to see themselves in this context of America, but allows all students to be able to make better connections, to be able to like realize that conflict shouldn't be so scary, you know, and to see opportunities where they exist.
Growing up, so I grew up, in the American education system, public schools. Growing up, I don't really remember learning about Asian American history or just a lot of Asian history. I think I learned a lot about, the Pilgrims, Christopher Columbus. And I remember my teacher in fourth grade really emphasized learning about each state in history, or social studies, we called it in elementary school. And then when I got to middle school, I don't even think we had a history class. Or maybe we did, but it was like an elective and we did it every other day. And it was kind of like a rerun of what we already learned, but more in depth. And then I got to high school and I took AP World History, and we learned about the Holocaust. And I think it was more emphasized on that history and not really anything else. I know I'm still learning now, and I don't really know much about how curriculums are made for history or anything. But I think learning about Asian history, or just history in general, that's more broad and not so picked at or selective, because I know a lot of history is important to what we're trying to do now. And if we use history and emphasize that for the change, I think it just works out better. It might be just where I grew up, because our curriculum may be different from like the history curriculum in California or something. I don't really know, but I'm still learning about curriculums and everything. But yeah, I think hopefully one day, hopefully soon, we can use a broader spin of history that's not so selective on things. Because growing up in the public school system, I don't really remember much about anything.
It's actually pretty strange to me that, yes, America is a big, big country, but every state gets to decide how their curriculum is like, and to a certain extent. And Mike, you mentioned Connecticut, and I think it was not long ago that I saw a news about Mexican, I think fifth or sixth grader in this class. She felt out of place because, like what Michelle has said, the history books that they learn don't really cover Mexicans' role in their history. And the whole class, it was really cute and also really phenomenal. The whole class went to testify in court despite COVID-19, so that they can have this little girl's heritage and history be recorded and be, more importantly, educated and passed on to the next generation. And so that's really important, I feel. And also that coloring book, I would want a copy of that coloring book. I did definitely, if it's for sale online, we'll definitely link it below in the description box, along with where we get basically the historical information from. And talking about the Asian diaspora, right? Talking about Asia, that's not just East Asians, which are what mostly people think of when we say Asia, which is like Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. We also have South Asians, like Indians and Filipino and Filipino, right? They according to what I read, they migrated here due to war and also colonization, which is ironic because the colonization happened by Western countries invading Asia, and then now they actually migrated here. But yeah, the reason why I mentioned that is because, like you mentioned, there are so many different languages, and at the same time, when people who are not Asian look at us, they are always like, oh, you look the same. You, whether you are Japanese or Korean or Chinese, you all look the same and you all eat the same food. And what you eat smells funny. And I personally have experienced that. In fact, when COVID happened, tying it back to hashtag I'm not a virus, students and even professors asking if Chinese restaurants in Chinatown or Asian restaurants everywhere is safe. And that's just anti-Asian, right? And people don't really see that. They see that as, oh, they're protecting themselves. They are, yes, they're ignorant, but they're trying to be safe. But that does harm people like us. It harms our mental health. It also makes us feel unsafe and they feel safe at the expense of essentially a whole community. And I also want to bring up a piece of American history where in the 20th century in San Francisco, which demonstrates that anti-Asian racism runs deep, that there was an Asiatic exclusion league that's dedicated to advocating for more expensive bans on Asian immigration. And then there was also Angel Island, which is actually near this exclusion league, which was an immigration station that had horrible conditions and people, I think it's closed off now, but historians who went in and took photos could see carved poetry on walls, and I read those poetry, and they were in traditional Chinese. There are two types of writing, right, for Mandarin, and they express sorrow and a longing for freedom. And it kind of makes me both proud and sad that your ancestors, given that I'm not from here, my family is not from the States, but the both of you are, that your ancestors had to go through all of that to find so-called either a better environment or just to survive. But yeah, what are your thoughts about, or have you actually have a conversation with your elders about how they came here or how their parents or grandparents came here?
So thank you for bringing that all up, right? The poetry from Angel Island, I have not thought about that in like about 15 years, and I think these poems, right, are access points into our collective grief and how we feel. I know my parents came here as refugees. They came here through war, famine, genocide, right? And they made a life for themselves, you know. So that's our story. So when we talk about mental health, there's a lot of trauma that comes in from being intergenerational, being the generation after being raised by parents that suffered so much horror. Kelly Ha, our campaign manager, and Jason and the Yukon Asian American Studies Institute, we created a mental health book for Asian Americans. It is a free resource guide. We are doing one for queer Asian Americans, but you know, the one that we are with Capturing Fire, the first edition with that's broad stroke Asian American. We go into this whole thing about food, like what did you pack in your lunchbox? You grew up in Singapore, so like you probably were able to pack all these things that you grew up eating at home. You know, I remember distinctly as a wedding photographer, I was in I eat all the fermented stuff, all the sticky stuff. I love like, cow feet, pork feet, chicken feet. Like I am my grandmother's grandson. And I remember being at a wedding in California, and after the wedding, we went to a Japanese yakitori place, and there was a Chinese American who was a groomsman at this wedding, and I think he was trying tendon or like liver or intestines, one of the things, and he had this eureka moment about how great this was, and he looks at us and he was like, "Kids used to make fun of me for eating this, and now these kids are the ones eating it for likes on Instagram, you know." And again, it goes back to our stories and our foods and who has ownership of it. I'm not trying to gatekeep, but like when can Asian American stories hold truth to themselves without being authenticated by someone else? And I think when you talk about Angel Island, you have that history there right on the walls as authenticated. It's going through someone's personal challenges, right? And that story should be heard. And with the Chinese American or the Chinese Exclusion Act, that set up a lot of racism, right? And then in the 1940s with World War II, they had these comics. It's like, how can you tell a good Chinese from a bad Japanese? I don't know if you've seen these comics, but they have these comics about what people should look like if they are XYZ, and let alone that the Japanese American, I believe it was the 442nd Battalion, was the most decorated unit in what's called in World War II. And on the same side, you also have the no boys, the Japanese Americans who refused to fight for the country because of what the country did to them, stripped them of their land, their identity, of their freedom. And and so which side of the stories can Asian Americans share? Do they have to share one? And I think that most of the time, us BIPOC folks, right, we are only allowed to share one part of our story. But we have a huge range of we are human. We have the human condition in us. We have joys, we have triumphs, we have pain, and we have sorrow. And for us to only be able to be pigeonholed and share one story, I think that's harmful for the safety and well-being of Asian Americans. One of the things that we are creating right now is this curriculum called History is Colorful that gives Asian Americans and all BIPOC communities access to artists and farmers and creatives that look like them. Because how can you see yourself as what's called as an artist if there are no artists that look like you?
When you mentioned about food and how now a lot of non-Asian folks are doing it for likes, it reminds me more also of the fox eye trend, right? We used to be called, slit eyes and things like that. And now people are trying to be like us, it's and they give it a different name, right? And just be like, oh, it's just fashion. It's just in trend, we're not trying to be like anybody. And it's like, it's not true. We used to be laughed at. We used to be made fun of for not having double eyelids. And I personally remember, even though I was not in the States at the time, I was in Singapore, I remember trying so hard to find how do I draw eyeliner on my hooded eyelids. And there was almost no YouTube videos because most of the YouTubers were white. And so, it really runs deep. And I think, you talk about authentication and approval, and that reminds me of a quote that went viral recently by Connie Wu, where paraphrase from her, she's like, how long more do Asian Americans and Asians want to have safety and stability that hinges on whiteness and white supremacy, which is the current system, right? And talking about the model minority myth, that you mentioned generational trauma. Your ancestors came here trying to survive, including your own, right, Mike? And part of that survival instinct is to please, is to conform to that current system, which we still have now. And that gave birth to the model minority myth, where while we are seen as other, and we are seen as never being able to be fully American, we are also seen as like the ideal immigrant. We are used as a shield in a way for white supremacy, and be like, look, all these Asians came here and they set up their life. A lot of them are entrepreneurs. One of them even went on to try and run for president. And so, if you pull up your bootstraps a little bit, y'all can have that too. And I think that is really harmful. And at the same time, I acknowledge that, as an international student and person in the States, I don't have that lifetime of experience to speak on model minority myth as in-depth as the both of you do. So if either of you are comfortable, would you all share your own experiences and your own probably epiphany with model minority myth and as an Asian American?
Okay, so I'm actually quite younger than everyone else on the team. I am not a arrivist, so I feel like, my generation is a little bit different. I mean, my generation is different from obviously their generation. We're still very young, 19s, 20s. Like we're just stepping into adulthood in the States. I think there's a good majority of us, because I know there's people who already know a lot about the history and the system we are in, but I also know there's a lot of us in my generation that don't know anything, but we do. But there's people who don't know anything about the system or anything like the laws and how it truly works. But I think those people, like, we know how to just be nice or accepting. Like, I think it just comes down to like your morals, like just being a good person, knowing what is good from bad, like knowing what's just like what's good and what's bad. I think a lot with my generation, or our generation, because we're still in college and stuff. There is still a lot of like confusion or misconceptions. There's a lot of not knowing things, but I also think there's a lot of people who are our age stepping up and sharing stories about our parents who came here from another country and going from the bottom to up. I don't know. I know that everyone has their own story, but I think I just think it comes down to like who we are and our morals.
So I think the new generation is just so much more organized and so much more thoughtful, right? I am the oldest person on the team at 35. So like the rest of the team just like makes old makes jokes at me, but I think that the younger generation is more so much more connected. But speaking of the Hmong minority, right? There's a quote by Go Zhang Bauer, who's Hmong American, who wrote, "We've had to share in the collective shame of the Hmong minority, but what have Asian Americans shared in the pain and suffering of the Hmong refugee narrative and threats of deportation?" When we talk about Hmong minority, I am Cambodian American. I identify as Cambodian American, then Asian American. And growing up, my friends were Vietnamese American. We were the children of refugees who lived on a specific street, right? Um, we were from working class backgrounds. My family, we lived in apartments until I was about 16 and my parents bought a home. So there's this idea of the duplex or like these smaller homes with 8, 10 people living in them and like 1,000 square foot. So the Hmong minority never felt something attainable to me. I didn't know that Asian Americans were seen as rich seen as rich or standard bearers, right? Until the movie Bad Luck Tomorrow came out, which ages me. Bad Luck Tomorrow was this Asian American movie, I believe by Justin Lin maybe, but it came out on MTV about these Asian Americans living in California that drove nice cars, that had lots of money into drugs and did really well in school. And that's when it hit me and my friends that we weren't the minority because we were all subpar students, right? you know, we were breakdancers and artists. And so when we talk about minority, again, that's kind of there's so much to unpack there. But when you see Asian Americans in one specific light, it erases all our existence out there. So how do we come together if there's all these different parts of us, right? And then again with minority, a lot of Asian Americans, one thing that we did was we did a photo series called "I'm Not a Threat" shortly after "I'm Not a Virus" with the Camorra Cultural Center and the Conservative Parents of Color of West Hartford. And I photographed about like 25 Black Americans, that were Black from the South, biracial. Some of them were there were queer representation, and there was so many stories, right? And our friends came up with the question, um, for COVID racism, I asked, have you experienced any racism during COVID? We've had about 2 folks share their stories on video. Many others shared their stories but weren't comfortable putting it on video, right? Or sharing it out there. Um, and then when we asked the questions like, when did you realize you were first Black in America, right? Um, Everyone had a story. I remember one person that came on. She's an educator. She's an educator. She works in equity. She shares that when she was growing up, there was a little girl, white girl that she was friends with, and they would play together in the neighborhood. And one day, the girl's mom comes in and gets her. And then the little girl comes back outside and goes like, "I can't be your friend anymore." And she goes, "Why not?" And it's like, "Because you're black." And this happened to her, and her parents explained to her what happened, what racism was. When the same story happened again in the 2000s with another one of our participants who wasn't invited to a birthday party when everyone else was, and this was a close friend of hers in grade school. And she goes, "Why wasn't I invited?" And the girl goes, "Well, my parents said you wouldn't fit in because everyone else was white, you know." And so she had her parents kind of explain to her why she wasn't invited. When you talk about Asian Americans, we don't have that language. When racism happens against us or is committed against us, we don't have the language to say like this was racist. And uncovering this language, right? I remember being in like elementary school and high school, and being, I had a poem in fourth grade that was published at like somewhere, and the teachers called my mom and asked if I plagiarized it. And my mom and my dad were like, "Oh, they think that you're smarter than you are, and that you're like above grade level. Good job." And it happened again in high school. And as an adult now, I realized that I was accused of plagiarizing because I come from a bilingual household, because I am brown, you know? And I think when we talk about these experiences with the Hmong minority, I spoke with two business owners during the course of virus that that were cheated out of their contract. They provided the work, but they weren't paid. And this goes back to the Hmong minority, right? It goes back to like, you're gonna be silent because you're Asian. We can trample over you, we can walk over you, and you just need to obediently do that. But if we don't have the language to frame it in that sense, then these acts of racism feel so personal against us, besides a part of a wider system, right? So I think that's what the Hmong minority needs to be. It needs to be these stories that connect us to the system of racism, right? And how these acts are perpetrated against us, and what that means for our social mobility, our economical mobility, and where our stories are being told, right? Yeah.
I agree. I think so. I consider myself Hmong American. My parents are Hmong. Not a lot of people know what Hmong is. Not a lot of Asians know Hmong. Like, people ask me, what are you, or where did you come from? I'm like, I'm Hmong, and we don't really have a country, but I guess you can consider us from Laos, because that's where my parents came from. So my parents came during the Vietnam War, and I remember my mom told me when she came here, she had to get a stamp on her, like right here. And like with the movies, I think growing up, people thought I was rich because I was Asian, because I am Asian. But I think a lot of people don't realize I'm not. I grew up in a low income city. I didn't really have much. I had enough. Like, I was happy as a kid. I had toys and stuff. I didn't have a lot of nice things, but I was happy with what I had. I think society does paint a picture, like Crazy Rich Asians, the movie. I'm sure we all watched it. Um, I went to go watch that movie senior year of high school. I remember it came out. Me and all my friends, like 20 of us, went to go watch it. We all walked in thinking we were cool, like high schoolers going in. And then during the movie, my friend was like, "Michelle, you can literally do that because you're rich too." And I was like, I wish I could. You know, I don't know why it's like that. Maybe it's just the society we're in. And I think we can, I know there's endless amounts of stories we can tell people. And if we sit down with someone, it's going to take us years to tell all these stories. I think, whoever we encounter, as long as we tell the story with whoever we encounter, I think that's enough, because we can't always just sit there and yap on and on and on about every single thing, because there's so much to cover, not just within like the Asian community, but within the rest of the communities we're in. I think just as long as, whoever you do encounter, you go about it in the right way, and say your story. It's always good sharing your story. um me and my friends now, I think we have a lot of good life talks. I don't really know much about, the generation above us, at least for the generation we're in, like 19s, 20-year-olds. I think right now, especially with COVID, it's just a time where, specifically this time with COVID, it's a time where all of us really like talk about life, because in a way we're kind of missing out on life right now because of all the restrictions. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a lot, but it's a lot of things to cover, but it's also not a lot. It's just hard to condense it because there's so much that we should talk about.
I think Michelle brings up a good point about our stories need to be told, right? And our not just that they need to be told, but there needs to be a space to have them, and there needs to be accountability. There's the story of the Rose Modi, who was in the 1980s. They were the Dot Busters in New Jersey. The Dot Busters were these groups of unruly white teenagers living in the suburbs. They attacked 12 South Asian Americans around the Jersey area already. It's these stories are chalked to boys being boys. Um, these kids are just having a good time, and these weren't kids; they were men. They were teenagers. They were 18 years old and up. And one day they run up on Rose, who's there with two friends, enjoying their day off, and they beat him to death with a bat. Or they beat him to death. And this is the 12th or 13th attack. And I think bringing this relates to what we saw at the Capitol, right? The insurrection that we saw, and where accountability comes from. What we saw was reminded me of like a modern day lynching. You had folks with Confederate flags. You had folks that were screaming, that were setting up gallows on the Capitol Hill. Is this not the same violence of like Watsonville, of Tulsa, Oklahoma? This is not the same violence that like Chinese populations faced, so that they were forced to move to the Delta, in the 1800s. These these are really real things that are happening, and the language that we use to describe what we're seeing is important too. And that's where accountability gets held in place. It's great that we can share these stories, but these stories need to change the system on feeling safe, right? And what safety means for BIPOC communities, not just Asian Americans, but just for BIPOC communities in general. Because there's so many things that there's a lot of inequities and a lot of hardships that our communities face that are both seen and unseen. And oftentimes folks may, like, I've had these conversations with friends where they go, well, are you making this a race thing? And you can't, and my thing is like, they go like, well, are you making this a race thing? Or if you talk about race, it will make things it'll more people will it'll make things worse. And I bring it to sexual assault. If there's not a language about sexual assault, then how do you know this is being perpetuated against you? So obviously, like, when we grew up with unwanted touching. If someone touched you, then they say, like, say something. If no one believes, if there's a system in place where no one will believe you, how likely will you be to share your story? Or how would you know this is being committed against you if you weren't talked to about this? And again, this could be put back towards race. And we have this conversation, right, about intentions. Well, it wasn't my intention to hurt you. Well, that's not how it should be framed. What you did hurt me, and that needs to be held accountable, regardless of your intention. And that could be either through education, it could be through different avenues where it is corrected, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think it's so important we move on that, especially with like college students. Now I know, well, from my experiences, like my freshman year, it's crazy how much people are so scared to speak because, just what society paints around that picture. Especially like, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know specifically like my best friends, and I have my girls, my best friend girls, my girlfriends. I know, like, specifically, I can I only can do so much to help someone. You know, I like for myself in like those type of situations, there's only so much as friends we can do. Like we can be there to support you, we can be there, you know, to hug you, to just be there with you. But it's just so much like there's more steps that needs to be done. Like the intention thing, like it wasn't my intention to touch you. Like people are still there's so many stories around it, and it happens so much that, you know, that specific change that Mike was talking about is something that's very important to me at least, but I'm sure to a lot of people, and that change needs to get going.
A lot is covered there. I want to acknowledge definitely there's intersectionality in the model minority myth and being a model minority. And I agree with the quote that Mike mentioned about collective shame. In Crazy Rich Asians, it's a film in Singapore, and it drives me crazy every time because the stereotype towards international students, especially Asian international students, and especially for someone like me who looks like I'm from China, is that the common stereotype is that I am rich. I don't have to worry about food and things like that. I don't have to worry about. I stay in Beacon Hill, which is like a very affluent part of Boston, and that's all not true. You know, I came here with literally just 2 bags of clothes and whatever I can bring. I think whenever someone mentions, oh, why does it always have to be about race? Call me radical, but I think everything is about race. Everything ties into race. That's the whole system. And that's the whole harm of modern minority myth. It's not just about stereotypes against us as Asians, but it's also about creating that tension and that divide between communities of color, not just Asian versus Black people, but also Asians versus brown people that can be in our own communities. You know, before this, I didn't know that both of you all identify as Hmong, and I have to say that I have heard of that, but I've not really looked into, you know, the history and the identity itself. And ignorance and silence is complicity, you know. We have to, while we have to stand up and say something, we also have to acknowledge that sometimes we are the one causing the hurt. We are the one who are ignorant, and that we need to say something and educate ourselves. And that's something that I thought to make it clear, because I think while we're talking about anti-Asian sentiments and attacks and racism, it's important to know that we are also, because of the history that we have in this country, that we are in this position where we are oppressed, but we also have the intersectionality of not having to experience what, for example, our Black and Indigenous peers face. And I think that's important to note. And I think about language, I feel that I hear, you know, from what Michelle was mentioned, you know, we have to talk about our stories, we have to share our stories in the right way, and saying, you know, I can only do so much to help. I think it's so ingrained in our culture and our identities that we are the ones who should be fixing the problems. We should always find solutions and we should always fix things. And also that whole notion of doing things right, when if we question ourselves what constitutes right and what constitutes wrong, especially if we're talking about social justice work, talking about dismantling systems, what is right and what is wrong. I think it's something that is I would say it's an interesting discussion to have um, as Asians and as Asian Americans.
So, that's a lot of great points you just brought up. Equity takes work. Equity is not a one-time deal. It's a long march, right? We're standing on the back of giants. And when we talk about anti-blackness, we have to discuss our own histories with it, right? And I think that takes self-reflection. It takes the capacity to kind of understand what you did wrong. And I can share a personal story where my best friend and his wife, my goddaughter, when they're pregnant with their daughter, who's my goddaughter, they were getting a doula, and both of them, he grew up around no children, and they're getting a doula, and I was making fun of him for being excessive, right? And the reason why we're excessive is in Boston we'll go to like Citizen. I don't know if you've been to Citizen in Boston, but as a whiskey bar. So we'd have a full meal. Before we had kids, we'd have a full meal, like appetizer, dinner, and dessert and drinks. And we'd finish and we'd go to the Japanese restaurant next door and have sushi. You know, that was kind of like what we did before we had kids. And I would make fun of him for having a doula. And he was like, "Oh, it's someone so we don't have to think about things, someone to like support us." And I just called him excessive, and I laughed about it. Before and after he had his daughter, because when we got pregnant, he was like, "You need one." During this time of COVID-19, when there's so much death and so many stories coming out, right? There was I learned that Black women and brown women, like Black and Latinx women, have a higher chance of risk during childbirth. So this is probably why that they had a doula. And for me, I couldn't wrap my head around it, at the time, because I didn't know why you needed someone to kind of advocate for you, because my family all had kids and they, there was no complication during birth. So I didn't get this. And then I read that article and I go, wow, I was participating in anti-Blackness, I didn't understand that this was a form of racism. I didn't realize that this health inequities, and you saw that during COVID-19. You saw that the destruction happens in Black and brown communities. And how does that affect us? There are these farmers from Xenia and Emmanuel are these two amazing farmers in Connecticut from they're at a farm in Simsbury, and they're part of our history is colorful curriculum. And they speak about being in this one farm space in the Hartford area that's supposed to be equity based, but it is but it doesn't feel that way, because in the height of COVID-19, or not in the height, but during COVID-19, they wouldn't let them in. They wouldn't let these BIPOC farmers in for a glass of water, because they assumed these BIPOC farmers were closer to COVID-19 than they were. So they were banned from coming to the office for a glass of water. They had to call in, they needed to speak to someone. And again, this goes back to being Black and brown, right? So to make these connections about these inequities and how they kind of really affect the people that are your neighbors, is something that we need to do a better job of doing. And I think the other thing is, for Asian Americans, I'll tell you, for our campaign, we've been really lucky and fortunate. And it's not just luck and fortune, it's the way the system is designed. Where racism at this widespread level, because usually it happens in pocketed communities, right? You would have like small, like San Bernardino with the shooting, they attacked mosque and they attacked temples, right? Where they wrote these things. Again, pocketed, completely pocketed. But with COVID-19, it became a national thing with racism against Asian Americans. So we've had ad agencies, we had institutions reach out to work with us, to help us, And what does that mean for Asian Americans? It means that we have I think my friend Nisa pointed out, she's the founder of Forced Director Project with her husband Oha, that works with police violence and families impacted by police violence. She said, as Asian Americans, we have a commitment, a duty to use our resources to better help out other communities that may lack it, right? And Gayu Cook, who is a therapist, I remember having a conversation with her, and she said that Asian Americans, we face trauma every few years. I can point out to these moments that I know of every few years, but to be Black in America means that you face this trauma every single day. Or a parking ticket can be a death sentence, or a speeding ticket, And for me, I remember being inherently scared of cops because, I am Southeast Asian, right? And I remember one time I was working at a restaurant, my cousin's restaurant, and one of my favorite regulars, who's this older white woman, told me that you can yell at cops, you can yell at them, you can scream at them, and if they stop you. And I didn't know this was true, so I tried it. I got stopped for a speeding ticket, and I tried it, and I just got a ticket, and I can't imagine what it's like to have that fear, and not just fear for your own well-being, but the fear of your actually, I do know how it feels during certain moments like COVID, but to have it every single day, I don't know that trauma of having to deal with this from like time I'm born until the time I'm old, because you're not just worried about your own safety, you're worried about your children, you're worried about your grandparents, you know. And it's we had to propose this question. It's like whose whose responsibility is it to make someone else feel safe? So when we did the I'm Not a Threat portrait, Adrian pointed out that, you know, she wanted photos of people not smiling. So we did one smiling, one not smiling, because Black people have always been forced, Black and brown people have always been forced to wear this mask to make everyone around them feel safe. And again, we had to propose the question, whose responsibility is it to make someone else feel safe, you know? And there's so many stories that can go through that. Like, you know, if you're at a store, my wife works at a place where there were these young Black teenagers that were being followed by security or by you know, management to see if they're shoplifting, and they're angry and they're loud. And my wife's coworker says like, I don't know why they're making a scene. And my wife goes like, they just saw people that, like, they just saw George Floyd die. They saw so many people that die, and they grow up seeing so many people that look like them get killed. They are scared. These young men aren't, you know, they're not causing a scene. They're scared. And who are you to like tell them like you can't behave this way to be scared, right? And I think that's kind of the space we need to create, right, for Asian Americans, a space for us to center ourselves around these tougher conversations, as well as be able to utilize some of our resources to uplift all of us, because we're all in it together, you know?
I agree. I feel like even though I've been here for a couple of years, it Asian culture persists in a way of we are always taught to mind our own business. And if we see something wrong and it doesn't affect us, we should always just stay silent and close one eye. And I think what people within our community don't realize is that for every time that we see our BIPOC peers being oppressed and being microaggressed against and we don't say something, it comes back and whip us. I think, like you say, it's time to start seeing us as a collective being instead of, oh, you know, like you're East Asian, you're South Asian, and you're Black, and so, you know, we're all different. Like, yes, we are all different, and the point of diversity is to have different opinions, but we cannot disagree on oppression. We cannot disagree on the fact that we will never experience what our Black and Indigenous peers face. And it's important to acknowledge that and to figure out how do we stand in solidarity and how do we act on that solidarity. I'm tired of hearing like, oh, you know, I'm so sorry I didn't speak up earlier because that person is not a bad person. That person, I don't think he or she meant it. I don't think they meant it. They are like good friends with me, and I'm so sorry I didn't speak up. And it's like the apology means nothing. And I think people more and more realize that now. If we're lucky enough to have experienced that, putting ourselves in their shoes and thinking about what will it be like if I was that person? Like, will my apology mean anything? And so, you know, we are close at time. So wrapping up what we talking about Asians in American history and how it built the society we know today, and the model minority myth and anti-Blackness. What would be some of your advice on how can we combat this?
I think as individuals, you know, I think it's important that we share individually and also come together for like this bottom line of, you know, just giving off more equality and facing the issues at hand now. So, you know, hopefully in the future, you know, generations from now, they don't have to be around what we're around constantly now.
I think one thing is create or find space where you can use your skill sets, right? I am a photographer. I didn't, you know, I didn't go what's called the I didn't go to school for equity work. I'm a photographer, I'm an artist, and I was able to find a way that my art can be used towards equity. We have Sheila and Vin. Sheila is our graphic design. What it's called our graphic designer, and Vin has been putting together all these materials for us, like our Asian American mental health book. So you might not need to, if you don't feel comfortable public speaking, or you don't feel comfortable sharing your stories, there are other ways that you can use your skill set to really empower the community. I think as Asian Americans, we need to see that our stories have weight. I think that many people think that, being Asian American, someone might not care about your story, but our stories are universal. They are just as universal as anyone else's stories. And I think that's something that we need to tap into, something that we really need to focus under. Because I know growing up, my mom was really, really loud and abrasive, and she is nothing like the stereotype of an Asian woman, right? And my dad though was more quiet. My dad didn't like sharing stories because he survived that way. That's not his fault. He survived the Cambodian genocide, the Khmer Rouge, by moving this way. And so that's how he wanted us to live too. But my mom was completely against the grain. And I think it's important for us to share that, right? And break these traumas that we might be held onto. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should use what we're good at. I know a lot of us aren't good at talking. I'm not good at talking at all, but I'm not good at public speaking, but I do like to talk to people just about life, and even whatever you like to do it in a meaningful way, even if that's like sports, because I know I play volleyball, and with playing volleyball, a lot of us, you know, we really just, it's just fun, with everyone, not just one specific group of people. It's anyone from anywhere, any culture. It's really just using what you're best at. It doesn't have to be always, like public speaking. I know a lot of people are shy. I know I'm shy, but yeah, it's whatever you're best at. Use your skill sets and make the most out of it, because that's essentially all you can really do.
Thank you. And we're talking about space, right? The both of you have created a space which is hashtag I'm not a virus. And so would you want to tell the audience where can they find you and how can they support your movement?
So we are on IG at iamnotvirus.info. Our website is www.iamnotvirus.info. We have a coloring book that's coming out soon. The first 1,000 copy, What Admirasia, is being donated to queer and Asian American spaces as well as non-Asian American spaces. We firmly believe that Asian American stories should not just be regulated into the Asian American households, but to all people. So that's something that we're working on. So we are gonna be doing a donation run for funding to go towards the Asian American Studies Institute at UConn. I am an activist in residence there, but the funding is not for me. They are gonna be they're going to be funding a capacity building to bring Asian Americans into the curriculum and how to do so. So it won't be just Google links, but really fleshed out all materials like what we've done with the coloring book, the mental health book, and our history is colorful curriculum. That I'm really, really excited about. That takes local narratives from BIPOC farmers, Asian American, brown, indigenous, Black farmers, so students from K to 12 can have conversations about mental health, about how to observe seeds growing, all the way to about land access and what it means to fit in, and not just fit in like a school setting, but like economically, socially.
I host a late night talk show, and it's mainly just a page or a safe space to just talk about life or absolutely anything we think of. I think it's important for us, again, like many of us, or at least I know, like a lot of us in my generation are really shy, and we don't really have that space to tell stories as much as, or don't know where to go to tell stories. So yeah, so anyone like to join, it's on, you guys can check out iamnotavirus.info on Instagram.
And all of those links will definitely be in the description boxes below for Anchor.fm and also for YouTube. And so lastly, before we leave, it would be soon Lunar New Year. And while we mentioned, the Asian diaspora has very different cultures, Lunar New Year is something that many of Asian cultures celebrate. It can take different names and different forms. For Chinese, it's called Chinese New Year, and for example, Vietnamese Americans, it's called Tet.
Yeah, Lunar New Year's reminds me that I'm going to turn 36 this year. I have 12 years. So, usually my family, we do a big gathering at my aunts and uncles, cousins, parents, the whole 9 yard, our children. I know that Lunar New Year's for many of us is going to be remote. We might not have the same foods that we're used to, or we might have to cook for ourselves. But I just want to wish you all a happy New Year's, and yeah, and safe celebrations.
Happy New Year's. I know I'm really big on volleyball, and 9-man is really huge in the community, and I wish we could play, or I wish I could watch, but I know with COVID rules, it's really not safe for that. But hopefully we'll be soon celebrating all the New Year's. Happy Lunar New Year, and hopefully volleyball soon. Na Zhong Zhong Chia, it means Happy New Year.
Suicide comes to mind means Happy New Year's. I am Cambodian American. My family is part Chinese. I consider myself Cambodian because the only thing Chinese about us is probably like a few words. Some of the dishes we cook, and New Year's. So
Nice. So mine's a bit more complicated. Okay, so I'm Singaporean Chinese, and so other than Mandarin, I also speak a little bit of Cantonese and Hokkien. And so for my Mandarin speaking, and also for my family who probably may not be listening, but in case you all are, 叶心怡在此祝大家新年快乐，身体健康，万事如意。如果你说广东的话，就新年快乐，恭喜发财。And to my Hokkien friends, the only thing I love and I know very well is Hua. I wish everyone have a really prosperous new year. And thank you for staying with us. Once again, you're listening to What's Going On by Suffolk University's Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion.